Uh, I'm joined by a few colleagues who I would love to have introduce themselves before we go into an overview of what we'll be doing in our hour this afternoon. So, as I said, my name is Lucy. I work on CalAdapt, particularly thinking about how some of the new tools that we're developing can be more responsive to the needs of California's growing adaptation practitioner community. Natalie, how about you? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course. Hi, Lucy. Excited to be here. I'm from Climate Resolve, and I'll be doing a demo later on in the presentation.
Awesome. We've also got a few folks who will be keeping an eye on the chat. Nancy Thomas from CalAdapt and Alex Moisa from Climate Resolve. So that's the team you've got steering the ship here for the next hour. The plan for the day is to first offer an introduction to CalAdapt, which is a platform that maybe some of you are quite familiar with, but maybe others have not yet come across. And then we'll be introducing the local climate change snapshot tool, which we released a few weeks ago in order to support a wide range of adaptation practitioners in accessing climate projections. We're hoping that this tool supports people with various forms of grant applications and compliance, whether that's in working toward SB 379 adaptation requirements, or as Natalie will present later, on affordable housing grant funding applications. And then Climate Resolve will walk us through one example of using this tool to come up with an Asic application, or at least the component of it that deals with climate change. And then at the end, we'll have the chance for some back and forth, some question and answer. So that'll be certainly one way to get your questions attended to. You're also welcome to type into chat anything that comes up throughout the conversation today, and my colleagues will either answer it in the chat or bring it up for larger discussion out loud. So to begin, what is CalAdapt? CalAdapt is a website that has been funded by the Energy Commission of the state of California, and more recently, the Strategic Growth Council from the state of California, in order to connect adaptation practitioners or folks who need climate change projection data with the data itself in ways that are visual, easily downloadable, and allow for a degree of customization without needing to run general circulation models or climate models yourself. We have sort of a tripartite mission. One is visualizing climate data through a variety of graphical user interfaces. Another is allowing folks to download climate projections in a variety of file formats, whether that is a simple CSV or a geospatial file, for example, a NetCDF file. And we also hope that CalAdapt is a way for folks to learn about climate science. And this is an increasingly big part of our mission, to teach the fundamentals of working with climate projections so that when folks need to think about adaptation at their own scale, you have the climate literacy necessary to do that. So we can take a look at CalAdapt itself. The URL is cal-adapt.org. And this is the homepage. It's undergoing some updates in the next few weeks or months. So you may see things shift around a little bit, but the general layout will be the same. We have a variety of tools listed right here on the front that connect you with visual representations of data sets. So for example, you can take a look at maps of projected change for the state of California to understand, as an example, how we anticipate that temperatures will change through time compared to a historical baseline. This is one example of the many tools that are on CalAdapt. There's also the opportunity to download data by clicking up here on the right on the data button. There are a few different processes to do that. We also have resources to teach you about climate change data, whether that's blog posts or past webinar recordings, or even resources for software developers. So that's a general sense of the layout and the mandate of this platform, but we'll dive into one specific element today, the local climate change snapshot tool. So this tool came about because in some stakeholder engagement, public conversations, work with state agencies over the past few years, the CalAdapt staff increasingly heard that what's on CalAdapt is great, but for the average user, it's too technical or it's too customizable. There are too many parameters, so folks first sign on to look for climate data and are overwhelmed by the number of options they have in front of them. And we've heard that the tools that we have serve a specific audience quite well, but a more general audience, one that's interested in an on-ramp to climate data, for example, or thinking about how to use climate data for education or advocacy, wanted something a little bit more pared back. And so this is the product that we've put together, and it's designed to be straightforward, introductory, and accessible. And in particular, support adaptation planning in city and county governments, in natural resource management, and in community organization advocacy work. Those are the folks with whom we worked particularly closely to develop it, to beta test it, those sorts of things. And the tool itself simplifies settings for parameters like general circulation models and time intervals so that the information is really quick to find. You don't have to toggle different buttons on and off in the way that you might for the customizable features of other CalAdapt tools. So I'll walk through the interface here, and then Natalie will give us a blow by blow of how she might use it in some of her work on affordable housing grant applications. So first, to access the tool itself, you can do so from the home page in two different ways. You can either click on Tools in the upper right-hand corner, which is highlighted here with an orange box, or you can click on the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool button in the list of tools there. Either will direct you to the same place. To use the tool, you will have to first select an aggregation boundary and a location. And I'll talk about what I mean by aggregation boundary. But ultimately, since this is the local climate change snapshot tool, you'll have to tell the tool where your local is. So that's the first step. The second step is to see projections for a collection of physical climate variables, things like temperature, precipitation, wildfire. There's data describing all of these projected impacts. And then lastly, we encourage you to not use this tool only for the purposes of the data contained in the tool, but to also use it as a way to connect to additional resources. So I'll highlight how the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool is integrated with other resources on CalAdapt and on other parts of the state's climate data infrastructure, for example, the Adaptation Clearinghouse, so that you can always dig further into things that you're interested in. I'll pause there. How are we doing on questions in the chat to my chat facilitators? Is there anything I should talk about out loud here? All right, I think we're good then. So when you first open up the tool page, this is what you're greeted with. The paragraph at the top highlights some of the general anticipated impacts for climate change in California. There's a short video that will give you a walkthrough of the tool if you like learning through videos. There are also links to other tools on CalAdapt. But really the meat of the interface is down here on the bottom half, where there's an inset map and the option to customize a location. So when you select a location, it will appear in the map. To select a location, you have to type it into the address bar here and then hit enter. You gotta remember to hit enter there. Natalie will demonstrate that for us. And then you can specify what type of aggregation boundary you are most interested in. Some examples of aggregation boundaries are counties and cities, some of the inbuilt ones that we have. So if I select county, for example, the map will update to show a bunch of counties in California, and I can pick one either by clicking on it or by typing into the address search bar to hone in on that county. When I do that, the data that I will be getting back from the tool is spatially averaged over the boundary that I select. So it's the average across all of San Joaquin County here, for example, or the average across all of Stockton, California. If that's not your jam, you can just stay with a single address, and that'll be a point location where you'll be pulling data for that one spot using, under the hood, a grid cell that's 6 kilometers by 6 kilometers. You then click the button Generate Snapshot, and you move to the next pane, where you'll have the option to work with data describing a few different climate impacts. We have a suite of temperature variables, some precipitation variables, and then currently a single wildfire variable, where you can see projections and access quick summary statistics of these projections for each of these anticipated impacts. Natalie will show us a couple today, but we want to let you know that there are, at this point, 8 different variables out there in this tool, and we will be adding more coming up. I believe that we have in the works an April 1st snow water equivalent data set that will be entered into the Local Climate Snapshot tool, and perhaps some others. We certainly welcome your feedback here. If in working with this interface you like it and you would like to see other climate data there, definitely drop us a line and we tend to be able to make that happen. So the interface itself will show you climate data in two ways. One is with a chart, with a graph that shows projected trends through time. And then the second is in a table. The graph is presented first, in the graph, we have the time on the x-axis, ranging from our historical period, 1950, all the way up through the end of the century, 2099 in this instance. You can see that there are a few different data series in the chart. The first is a observed historical series, so that dark gray line is for this location, the observed historical annual average minimum temperature. You can see the impact here is in the top of the graph. The annual average minimum temperature is the average of every day's minimum temperature for a year. So that would be what's going on here. We have then two different projections, and the two projections align with two different emission scenarios. Emission scenarios are often described with the acronym RCP, which stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. It's the pathway of the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the two scenarios that are often used in California, in part because they are useful for risk analysis and in part because they're endorsed by state agencies, are RCP 4.5 and 8.5. And on the next slide, I'll detail more specifically what those are. Just know that they're different emission scenarios, and one is purple and one here is teal. The data itself comes from 32 different climate models that are commonly used in California that have been downscaled using statistical methods from a low resolution data set to a finely resolved spatial data set. That's just if you're curious about it. There are links throughout the tool to what the downscaling process is, but ultimately to work with this information, you don't actually need to know some of those behind the scenes mechanics. The data presented in the tool is the average of all 32 models as a way to capture the full suite of possible climate conditions and models that have been used in California, where the shaded envelope is the full range of the models. So it's the minimum value that a model spits out to the maximum value that a different model spits out. And then the darker line through the middle of the series is the average of all the 32 models. So you have in this tool a sense of the central tendency or the average trajectory, as well as the range of possibility represented by the shaded areas there. This is definitely a lot of information to process at once if you've never engaged with climate projections before. So we want to draw your attention to some resources on the left here that will connect you with a little walkthrough tour of the visualization that will describe the data and that will clue you into best practices for working with this information. But to return to our RCPs, the RCP 4.5, that teal series, is the medium emissions scenario, where global emissions peak by the year 2040 and then decline. Put casually, this is sort of a middle of the road scenario and does hinge on emissions reductions happening after 2040. We then have RCP 8.5, which is often described as the high emissions scenario, and sometimes with the parlance business as usual, because it seems as though we have not yet deviated from this trajectory, wherein global emissions continue to rise throughout the 21st century. These two emission scenarios are commonly used in modeling in California, and the one that you work with will depend a little bit on what you're doing with the data. If you are particularly risk averse, you might choose RCP 8.5 because it shows the more extreme trajectory for emissions and corresponding climate change impacts. You may also have a funder that specifies one way or the other which or both of these to use. Know that these are the terms out there used to describe emission scenarios, and your mileage may vary based on what you're using the data for. The tool also will present a table capturing some of the statistics from the chart. So you will be presented with baseline data for the period from 1961 to 1990. You'll be presented with mid-century data for the 30-year period from 2035 to 2064. And you'll be presented with data for the end of century period from 2070 to 2099. It is generally best practice when working with climate data to use the average of a time interval that's at least a couple of decades long. Climate is the long-term pattern in weather, and so we need to, appreciate that. Looking forward, we need to have a long-term view of weather patterns in order to be able to accurately describe climate. If in looking forward we select any one year, we run the risk of selecting a year in the projections that's anomalous and doesn't otherwise describe average conditions toward the end of the century, for example. So let this be my little plug to always temporally average data over at least a 20 or 30-year period when thinking about future climate conditions. The tool does this for you automatically. You don't have the option to change the time periods presented, in part because these are common planning periods, in part because we want to encourage folks to work with temporally averaged data, and in part because in many California-specific use cases, these are the periods that are encouraged. For each one, you have presented the change from the baseline, which is the modeled historical baseline here. You then have the 30-year average, the absolute value, and then you have the range. You may want to work with the range if you're doing sensitivity analysis. You may need to work with the average if you need a single value. Again, your use case may vary, but we hope that this is a simpler way to look at the data than what is presented in many of our other tools. And in the Q&A session, we can go more specifically into what each of these mean. Natalie will talk about how she pulls figures out of this table for her work on Asic applications. But the moral of this story here is that for this location, we're looking at a particularly hot future under both medium and high emission scenarios by the end of the century. You're able to download the graphics and the data using the buttons below the table and the chart. So if you prefer to have it on your own hard drive for whatever reason, rather than taking screenshots, you by all means go for it. And then lastly, at the bottom of the page, there are links to additional resources. First, other tools in CalAdapt that describe the impact you're looking at. So for example, for temperature impacts, you would be directed to either the annual averages tool, the extreme heat tool, or the maps of projected change tool. There are also other resources listed, for example, CHAT, the California Heat Assessment Tool, the Adaptation Clearinghouse, the Fourth Climate Change Assessment Regional Reports. And whenever you are clicking on one of these additional resources where the resource itself requires some customization to access information, whether that's a CalAdapt tool where you have to input a place, for example, or the Clearinghouse where you have to input a variable of interest, the link from the local climate change snapshot tool will do that for you automatically. So in going from the temperature view of the local climate change snapshot tool to the Clearinghouse, you'll be directed specifically to a list of temperature adaptation resources. Or if you go to the annual averages tool from the local climate change snapshot tool, it will be pre-populated for the location you are already looking at. So we hope that that makes it a little less friction laden to move between sources of information here. And with that, that's the end of my spiel. I'm happy to take a question or two out loud as a way to interrupt the flow before I turn it over to Natalie. So is there anything, Nancy, that's come up in chat that I should attend to here?
Yeah, we do have a few questions, and thanks for that great introduction, Lucy. That's great. We had a question on whether we have plans to include uploading a shapefile for the local climate change snapshot tool. And I'm happy to take that question. So that's a great question. As a lot of CalAdapt users may know, many of our more complicated climate tools allow you to enter your own shapefile in and get data for your specific area of interest. So the other tools on CalAdapt really allow more user input and customization. So the snapshot tool is actually designed specifically to be a more simplified entry into CalAdapt with less complexity and less options for users to turn things on and off. So I would say we aren't intending to add that into the local climate snapshot tool. You can use other tools on CalAdapt and put your own shapefile in. But that said, I'm really interested in hearing if that's a feature that a lot of users are interested in. That is something that we could consider building into the tool. So hopefully that answers the question. Feel free to respond in chat if you have more questions about that. We also have a question from Natalie. Question for everyone. Natalie's curious about how folks are using CalAdapt data in your work or plan to use it.
I'm just curious if folks want to drop that in the chat as I'm presenting is fine.
Great.
That is everything we have at the moment.
All right. Well, then I'll turn it over to Natalie, who will share her screen, and we'll be ready to go.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Natalie Hernandez. I'm the Associate Director of Climate Planning and Resilience at Climate Resolve. I'm calling in from my home in Long Beach on historic Tongva land. And I am really happy to join the CalAdapt team today because I've been working with them for about the past couple of years. And I know that they have been doing a lot of background work to get this tool together and engaging with my organization as well as other stakeholders. So if you don't know about Climate Resolve, I'll take a minute to explain our organization to you. We're a local nonprofit, and we believe that climate change is a global problem. However, many of the solutions are local. Climate Resolve focuses on communicating how climate change will affect us and what opportunities we have to make an impact and empower people on a relatable level. At our heart, we're an advocacy organization, and we push for climate legislation at a state and local level. And we also advocate for funding to help people bike, walk, or take public transit in their communities. We also do outreach in communities to educate residents on climate impacts and connect them with rebates and grant resources, such as those offered by LA Department of Water and Power in Southern California, Edison. And lastly, our organization links climate science to community projects and planning efforts, which is why I'm here to speak with you all today. During this session, I'll be linking the CalAdapt Local Climate Snapshot tool to the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, or Asic program, which provides grants and loans to projects that achieve GHG emission reductions and benefit disadvantaged communities. The program helps low-income communities and households through increasing accessibility of affordable housing, employment centers, and key destinations via low carbon transportation, resulting in fewer vehicle miles traveled, shortened or reduced vehicle trip lengths, or mode shifts to transit, bicycling, and walking. The ASIC program is administered through a competitive grant program by the Strategic Growth Council and Department of Housing and Community Development. ASIC is one of the first grant programs to integrate the CalAdapt Local Climate Change Snapshot tool into its grant process, which is what I'll be demoing today. And I want to note that the round 6 application period for ASIC just opened, and applications are due June 8th, 2021. This is a snapshot of what the Asic Matrix looks like in the grant application, and just want to give you a general idea of it. It will be downloadable quite soon on the program website, and I think my colleague Alex is going to drop in that website. And this matrix is submitted alongside other application materials as an Excel sheet. The matrix asks applicants to report out data on 4 types of climate impacts: heat, precipitation changes, wildfire, and sea level rise. The first 3 of those climate indicators and the data can be found in the local climate change snapshot tool. And zooming into the matrix itself, this is what some of the cells look like. Right here, it's asking for 8 data outputs and requesting them for 1 climate indicator in 3 time periods. The 3 time periods in the top 2 rows are observed, historical, mid-century, and end of century. And then it's asking only for 1 RCP for mid-century, but 2 RCP projections for end of century. Some would say that we only look at the RCP 8.5 in the near term because humans haven't done enough to curb GHG emissions, and climate change between 2034 and 2064, we maybe don't have the ability to change some of that, but we have the possibility to curb or worsen climate impacts end of century between 2070 and 2099. So that's why, for example, we're only looking at 1 RCP in mid-century and then 2 in end of century. as Lucy mentioned earlier, each state grant program is a little different. And I just want to reiterate that these outputs are being requested uniquely to the ASIC program. And now I'm going to kind of exit out of this screen and go to the live demo on the CalAdapt website. So let me do that. Let's see. Just need to put exit. Okay. Okay, so this is the CalAdapt local climate change snapshot tool that Lucy showed. I'm actually going to put in an address here that is for downtown LA. It's 525 S Hewitt Street, Los Angeles, California, 90013. And then you click enter to have that pop up. Click here and then put generate snapshot. And want to, let me use my spotlight tool. Annotate. Okay, so right now we're going to be looking at temperature as one of the climate indicators. And we're actually not going to toggle with this to have it be the extreme heat days. And the reason I wanted to show extreme heat days is to talk a little bit about threshold temperature. So threshold temperature is one of the first things that pops up when we click on extreme heat days for the location 525 South Hewitt Street in downtown Los Angeles. And for this particular location, we'll notice that the threshold temperature is 97.9 degrees. And it means that any day above 97.9 degrees in downtown Los Angeles is considered an extreme heat day. But I want to note that this temperature varies for different parts of the state. So in Fresno, it might be 106 degrees, which is considered an extreme heat day in that area of the state. Let me know if that makes sense, or you can put a question into the chat if that didn't. But one of the reasons I wanted to also show and talk about extreme heat days is sometimes that's a more extreme climate impact that folks are more familiar with when thinking about, well, what does heat really mean in the increases that are going to happen over the next years or so. And so now that we've looked at extreme heat days, I'm going to skip threshold temperature. I'm going to skip down to the bottom half of the page because this is where we'll see some of those outputs that were being asked for in the matrix. The first one is observed historical. And so that's right here. And the average over the time period from 1961 to 1990 was 4 days. Those are the extreme heat days that were over 97.9 degrees on average. But if we look towards mid-century and at a high emission scenario, that average could go up to 10 days above 97.9 degrees. If we're looking at end of century climate projections, that could possibly go up to 11 days on average of heat days that are above 97.9 degrees. And that's if we curb emissions. And if we're doing business as usual and not curbing emissions, that could potentially go to 23 days of extreme heat during the year. And so, I mean, the goal would be not to get to this 23 days and be able to curb greenhouse gas emissions. I also want to note that Lucy talked about this before, but if you have any questions, again, about the time periods that are being used or any of the data here, we have this table, which I think is really helpful. And then sometimes grant applications will actually ask you to download like a graphic of this or data. And so you can do that by clicking on these two buttons here. The next thing I'll go to is I'm going to exit and actually go back to my slides to take a step back and think about, well, what does this really mean for affordable housing sites? At least for the ASIC grant application, it's important to ask, what does it mean to adapt to extreme heat in an affordable housing development site? And it's important to know that extreme heat causes dehydration, heat stroke, and heat exhaustion. And it's a public health crisis that could affect residents that live in an affordable housing site. So when thinking about designs, there's a need to have trees, shade canopies over well-used parts of the building, bus shelters, energy efficient conditioning, and then cool roofs and cool pavements. So that is how climate science, which we kind of just looked at in the matrix, can help inform designs that are done for affordable housing. So I have one more demo to show. Let me go exit this again. Go back to the CalAdapt slide. And I'll scroll up here to show one more climate indicator today, which is precipitation. And what I like about this local climate snapshot tool that's actually different from folks who might have done the ASIC application last year is you don't have to exit out to go to a completely new tool. Again, you click and toggle over temperature, precipitation, and wildfire. So I just showed you extreme heat days through the temperature section, but now I'm going to the precipitation section just by clicking this, and I didn't have to do anything to change my address. So by clicking on precipitation, I'll go with the climate indicator that's the default, called maximum one-day precipitation. And in other words, that's the maximum daily precipitation amount for each year and the greatest amount of daily rain or snow over a 24-hour period for each year. So again, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom half of the page, which is more relevant for the matrix, and look at some numbers here. The matrix asks us to look at the observed historical between 1961 and 1990. The 30-year average and per year would be that a place like downtown Los Angeles would get 2.23 inches on one day as a maximum precipitation. That's about the average that would come during that rain period. If we're going to select and look at the high emissions RCP scenario for mid-century, this could go slightly up and would end up being 2.36 inches. If we're looking at the end of century, again, between 2070 and 2099, this in a low emission scenario, or sorry, medium emission scenario with RCP 4.5 would go up to 2.371 inches. And in a high emissions RCP scenario could go up to 2.509 inches. And again, you can go to this table right here on the left if you wanted more information about the time periods and also the changes in the data and the 30-year average. And then could also go down here to download the graphics or the data. And going back to the actual changes itself, it's not as extreme as what we saw with the extreme heat days. But what the data overall shows is a place like downtown LA doesn't get much rain. And even when it does on like one day, there's still like not that much. And this could be coupled with long periods of drought. And though I won't go into this today, you can actually look at maximum lengths of dry spells in the different areas. So that's something to consider looking at as well. And so I'll go back to my slides. And similarly to what I was talking about with the affordable housing sites, as well as just wanting to take climate science and really think about, well, what does this mean for designs? And what does this mean for like on a day-to-day basis, residents living in affordable housing? And so I mentioned in downtown LA, it looks like water will not significantly increase and maybe not be readily available in the coming years. There's potential uncertainty. And when it does rain, it will be important to capture it. And that will help with the periods of time where there might be longer drought. So that's why more stormwater capture designs are needed in affordable housing. And this comes in the forms of rain barrels and bioswales, recycled water on site, and then native and drought tolerant plants. And the last thing I want to share is a tip sheet that my colleagues actually put together. They're on the call, Bryn and Alex, so shout out to them. I think they might have already dropped this into the chat, or if not, I think they'll drop it in now. But this is a tip sheet that we have created that's on our website. and can kind of walk you through some of the demo that I did today, as well as explain more about the Asic program. I'm also going to put my contact information up if you have questions about the Asic program and technical assistance. So I'll stop there and then see if Nancy or Lucy want me to go over anything in particular or just take questions.
I think at this point, we can absolutely take questions. Thank you, Natalie, for that walkthrough. So do folks have questions about what Natalie presented or what I presented? I've seen a few in the chat. So we'll start there, but by all means, you can raise your little Zoom hand and we'll see that on our end as facilitators and call on you, or you can put things in the chat. One of the questions I would like to direct to Shruti, who is one of the developers on CalAdapt. Erica writes, when analyzing raw data, is there a way to download more than one location's data file, essentially to do a bulk download for multiple places? Erica's working on a grant-funded project involving the Sierra with 22 counties and 46 jurisdictions. Shruti, what would be the way that you might recommend somebody goes about that process?
Yeah, so the local climate snapshot tool does not have a bulk download feature. I think if it's like 22 counties and depending on what data you need, we do have a data download tool, which you can upload multiple boundaries at a time. And so that would be one route to go. Other route is to download the data set and run the analysis locally.
Does that get to the meat of your question, Erica, or is there something we might have missed there?
Sort of. I think one of the things that I think USGS has it is where you can actually download, you can click like the locations and then which indicators, and then you can download it all into a zip, which kind of saves the researcher a little bit more time. Maybe more so just a recommendation.
Great, we'll take recommendations. Make a note of that on my end. Another question, just going through things here in the chat, is there a particular reason why the mid-century climate projections range around 2050, so a 30-year interval centered on 2050, but the end of century is 2070 to 2099? I think the short answer is a lot of modeling efforts have not necessarily been fully extended past 2099, such that that is the range of our end of century and some of the more robust data sets. It's also the period that many different planning entities, particularly in California, have coalesced around as being relevant to our work. Not too far out, but also not too soon to consider quote unquote end of century. So some of it is the science and some of it is just simply the practice. Sea level rise modeling is a little different, where a lot of that work has been done out to 2150. In part because of sort of the capital intensive nature of a lot of sea level rise adaptation. So I think as we move through time and the science continues, we'll see more resolution around an end of century period beyond 2099. So that window is centered closer to the end of century, but for now, we're not quite there yet. Other things in chat, Christopher's noting that if you are an R expert, you're welcome to bulk download data using the statistical programming language R. We've recently developed a package called CalAdapt R to access information in a development environment. There's some documentation on our website about that, and we can certainly connect people with that via email if you'd like things that way. That's no problem. Other questions here. There's a question in the chat about, why have we chosen this extreme heat threshold as being relative to any one place? Why isn't there a single temperature standard, 98 degrees, for example, that is considered extreme? And I think the answer is twofold, and this is just me opining from the position of my scientific training. One is that the experience of a temperature is not exclusively dependent on the temperature itself. Things like humidity and wind will also come into play in determining what has public health impacts. And every community has a different history with extreme temperature. You know, somebody who lives in coastal Northern California may not have access to many of the technologies that insulate people in Palm Desert from extreme heat. They may not have air conditioning or otherwise cool buildings. So a lower temperature may be extreme in its impacts than in places that are historically accustomed to hotter temperatures. So the way that extreme heat has been defined in the California adaptation community is as the hottest 2% of days, referencing the historical baseline period for any given place. So there will always be, looking backward, 4 extreme heat days on average per year, because that's actually the definition of it. It's the 98th percentile, which translates to approximately 4 days per year. Looking forward, then the question is, how many of those days defined at that 98th percentile translated to a specific temperature for a place will we see through time? So that's a quick overview. If these are things that folks would like more explanation on, we definitely welcome emails and you know, comments in the chat and that sort of thing, because we're continually trying to develop educational resources, and knowing what questions and concepts people are working with is really helpful to us.
And I'm glad you brought that up and other folks did in the chat, because to me, one of the reasons I picked that climate indicator to show is, you know, during summer, sometimes that's the most prominent kind of feeling that people have when they're like, I remember that day that was like above 97.9 degrees in downhill and I had no AC, or like in Fresno and they're walking to the bus and stuff. And so I encourage people to like toggle and look at that indicator, because it is really helpful to try and communicate the climate science.
Are there any other questions? We've got 10 minutes to take care of them, and if nothing's on people's mind, we can certainly close early, but want to give you as much time as we have.
I also wanted to add, Lucy, that Asic is one of the first grant programs to use the climate change snapshot tool, but there's another grant program through the Air Resources Board called the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project grant program that has also referenced CalAdapt. And I think more and more state programs are probably going to start to do that and ask for climate impacts in grant applications. So it's a good tool to get familiar with, even if folks aren't applying to a grant right now.
All right. Well, then I think we may end a few minutes early. Thank you to everybody for coming. We hope that this was a useful introduction to the tool and that this inspires you to go use it in your own life. We're always happy to take questions. You can email us at support@cal-adapt.org. We monitor that inbox quite regularly and aim to be prompt in our responses. We'll take questions in that inbox about the science or the data. We'll certainly take suggestions for new tools, new data sets, new resources there. And you're also welcome to subscribe to our newsletter. Natalie, if you want to pop to the next slide, I believe there's a link there for people to access that newsletter. So caladapt.org/signup.html.
And Lucy, when will the recording be out? Sent out
Sure.
to registrants?
Yeah, we will have the recording posted on CalAdapt likely early next week. It usually takes us a couple of days to get it uploaded and ready to go.
Thank you.